When Lady Margaret saw her husband's brother rise beside the coffin and draw off his gloves with that deliberate slowness which in him was always a herald of cruelty, she understood that the whole hall had ceased to breathe the air of mourning and had begun instead to breathe the air of judgment. The candles burned on either side of Lord Edmund's body, wrapped in its dark linen shroud, and the smoke of the incense climbed slowly toward the blackened beams of the manor house, while the murmur of prayer beads, which until that moment had been the only sound in the night, fell silent in the hands of the village women. Sir Walter let his eyes travel over those gathered, kin, servants, the whole parish crowded against the walls, and waited, as a man waits who knows that silence too can be commanded, before he spoke. Margaret, standing beside the bier, her dark veil framing her face and her wooden beads still tangled between her fingers, did not move. She had learned in 12 years under that roof that the first mistake was ever to show fear. "I thank all of you gathered here for the care this woman gave my brother in his sickness," Sir Walter said. And his voice was so measured, so reasonable, that many of those present nodded before they understood where he meant to lead them. "But the House of Ashcombe cannot remain in the hands of one who carries none of its blood, and there being no writing to protect Lady Margaret upon these walls or these pastures, it is only just that, once the burial is done, she leave this hall with nothing but what she wears as she came into it." A murmur passed through the hall, not of surprise, but of that discomfort the common folk feel when they watch, in public, the thing they had already suspected in private. Lady Alice Walter's wife lowered her eyes to her own lap, and Hodge the steward set his jaw and said nothing, for he had served that house for 30 years and knew exactly how much silence was required to go on serving it. Before we go further with this story, I would love to know from what corner of the country you're joining us today. Leave in the comments the name of your town or your county, because every story sounds different depending on the place from which one lives it. Margaret listened to her brother-in-law's words without a single muscle of her face betraying them, though inwardly, she felt each one fall like a stone upon something she had spent years building. The nights kept in vigil at Edmund's bedside, the household accounts she herself had set back in order when the sickness took from him the strength to keep them, the sheep pastures she had learned to name one by one, because he had taught her their names walking arm in arm on autumn evenings. None of it bore any writing. None of it, in that hall, counted as proof. It was then that Walter, emboldened by the very silence he himself had made, stepped toward the coffin and held out his right hand toward Margaret. "And that ring," he said, pointing to the gold and garnet she had worn upon her finger since her wedding day, "belongs to this family. There is no reason it should leave this hall on the hand of a stranger." The word stranger hung in the air like the smoke of the candles, and Margaret felt something harden within her, not from anger, but from that particular steadiness known only to those who have decided, long before the insult ever comes, that they will not give their offender the spectacle of a single tear. She closed her right hand over the ring, not to deny it, but because her brother-in-law's gesture suddenly seemed so small beside her husband's body that she felt, for a moment, more pity than fear. Sir Roger de Vere, seated among the invited gentry, shifted uneasily in his seat with the discomfort of a man who had stood as godfather at a wedding and now watched the memory of that marriage trampled underfoot. But he said nothing. It was not his place, in that hour, to speak in another man's hall. Father Cuthbert, however, who had kept vigil over the body since dusk with his breviary held in trembling hands, lifted his gaze toward Walter with an expression none of those present could quite read. It was not surprise, but something nearer to the patience of a man who already knows the ending of a story others have only just begun to hear. The old priest did not speak either. He only made the sign of the cross slowly over Edmund's body, as if that gesture alone were, for the present, the only answer he could allow himself. Margaret turned her eyes at last from her brother-in-law and fixed them upon her husband's still face, serene beneath the yellow light of the candles, and in that instant she remembered the last morning he had been able to speak with any clarity, weeks before, when the fever had left him ever shorter respites. He had taken her hand with a strength his body no longer possessed elsewhere, and had said to her, his eyes fixed on hers, "Do not fear what they say when I am gone, Margaret. I have already spoken for you where it needed speaking." She had not understood those words then, Nor had she thought of them again until this moment, with the whole hall waiting to see her driven, disgraced, from the house she had governed for a decade. Now, as Walter still waited with his hand outstretched toward the ring, that sentence returned to her memory like an ember that refuses to die entirely beneath the ash. "I shall keep this ring," Margaret said at last, and her voice, though low, was heard clearly through the hall because no one else dared breathe loudly. "Until one with better right than you, Sir Walter, comes to ask it of me." It was no shouted challenge, no accusation. It was only a sentence spoken with the same steadiness with which she had closed her husband's eyes hours before, but it was enough to make Walter's face tighten for an instant, just long enough for Alice, his wife, to lift her eyes and look at him with a new strangeness. As if for the first time she wondered what lay behind his insistence upon a ring of so little worldly value. Walter withdrew his hand, gathered his mourning cloak about his shoulders, and announced, in the voice of a man who considers the matter already settled, that Margaret would have until the morning after the burial to leave the hall, and that she would be lodged out of Christian charity in the old bakehouse by the manor wall until she decided where else she might go. The burial was held the next day beneath a low gray sky, with the bells of Ashcombe tolling slowly over the stone roofs, and the whole parish, wrapped in dark cloth, followed Edmund's body to the family chapel, where he was laid to rest beside his first wife, dead these 20 years. Margaret walked behind the coffin with the firm step of one who will not let her knees be seen to tremble, and felt upon her, the whole way, the gaze of the village divided between pity and that cruel curiosity always roused by another's fall. When the mass for the body was ended and the family withdrew toward the manor house for the morning meal, Father Cuthbert came to her with the slow step of his 66 years and, taking her arm, led her toward the churchyard, away from listening ears, as one leads another to a place where, at last, something true may be said. That same evening, with her few belongings bound in a bundle and rain beginning to fall over the slate roofs of Ashcombe, Margaret prepared to make her way to the bakehouse, resigned to spend there the weeks needed before deciding whether to return to her kin in York, where a cousin of her first husband still lived, or to seek shelter in some priory of the shire. It was then that Father Cuthbert reached her in the rain, his breviary held close against his chest to shield it from the wet, and stopped her with a trembling hand upon her arm. "Lady Margaret," he said, and in his voice was an urgency she had never heard from him in 30 years of acquaintance. "Your husband made me swear, in the last confession I heard from him, that I would not let you leave this parish before the 7th, before the week's mind of his death was kept. There is something laid up in the church chest that I may not name, nor touch, nor reveal until that Mass. For so he himself ordained it with his own hand, sealed with his own signet. I can tell you only this: keep silence, keep patience, and be present." Margaret stood motionless in the rain, feeling the water soak through her veil and run cold down her neck, while the priest's words made their slow way into her understanding, as water makes its slow way between the stones of an old wall. She thought again of Edmund's hand gripping hers, of that sentence spoken with the little strength left to him. "I have already spoken for you where it needed speaking." She understood, with a clarity that raised the hair on her skin more than the cold of the rain, that her husband had not died leaving her defenseless against his brother's cruelty, but had spent his last weeks of life preparing, in the silence of confession and through the one bond that no soul in that parish could violate without committing sacrilege, a defense she herself did not yet know. She did not know what that chest held, nor what words her husband had set down with a hand already weakened by fever, but she knew, with the same certainty with which she had known how to close his eyes, that Walter, in his pride, had shamed a woman without knowing that the man he had just buried had left for her, locked away in the house of God, a letter bearing her name. The old bakehouse by the manor wall smelled of cold ash and damp stone, and it was there that Lady Margaret spent her first nights after the burial, wrapped still in the same mourning cloak she had worn to see her husband into the ground, listening to the late autumn wind whistle through the broken thatch above her. No one of the Ashcombe family came to ask whether she had bread enough, save Hodge, the steward, who twice a week brought her a loaf and a bit of salted bacon wrapped in a cloth with the excuse that it was ordered by plain neighborliness, and not by charity. for he knew well enough that Margaret, he remembered it clearly, had never in her life taken alms from anyone while she governed that household. The widow of Lord Edmund, the same woman who had kept the accounts of the sheep pastures and seen to the shearing in the last years of her husband's illness, now spent her days spinning wool beside a narrow window, counting down the days until the week's mind mass the way a besieged household counts down the days of a siege. Sir Walter, for his part, soon found that matters were not proceeding quite as he had planned. The sexton, a loose-tongued young man named Watt, mentioned one afternoon at the village alehouse, without weighing the reach of his own words, that Father Cuthbert spent hours shut up in the vestry, talking to that chest as if the dead Lord Edmund himself could hear him, and that he had ordered the iron lock on the parish coffer reinforced. The news reached Walter's ears before nightfall, and he, a man in the habit of leaving no loose thread untied when it touched his own estate, sent word to the priest to attend him at the manor house, under the pretense of settling the arrangements for the week's mind mass. Father Cuthbert came with his breviary under his arm and his step slower than usual, for the 66 years upon his shoulders weighed heavier still when he sensed a storm gathering. "Father," said Walter, seated behind the oak table that had belonged to his father and which he now claimed with the same ease with which he claimed everything else, "I am told you keep papers of my brother's in the vestry. As head of this house now, it is my right to know what worldly business he left unsettled." The priest, who had spent 3 decades hearing confession from half the parish and knew well how to tell honest curiosity from a threat dressed in courtesy, answered with the calm of a man who has rehearsed the same words 1,000 times. "What your brother set down, Sir Walter, belongs to God until God himself appoints the hour of its revealing. There is no paper in my keeping that touches worldly matters. There is a sealed will that shall be read when its time comes, and neither you nor I have the power to hasten that hour." Walter narrowed his eyes, measuring the old man as one measures an adversary he had not expected to find in a man of brown wool and trembling hands. And for the first time since the wake he felt, not fear yet, but that cold unease felt by men accustomed to having everything bend before them when something at last refuses to bend. That same week, Lady Alice, Walter's wife, came to the bakehouse under the pretext of bringing extra blankets, and there, seated across from Margaret by the cold hearth, let fall a question she had turned over in her mind for days without quite knowing why. "Tell me, Margaret, do you know why my husband is so set upon that ring? It is worth little enough, and yet he speaks of it as though his very life hung upon it." Margaret, who had learned to measure her words as one measures water in a time of drought, answered only that she did not know, though inwardly that question of Alice's, asked with a sincerity Alice herself seemed startled to feel, confirmed what she had already suspected since the rain in the churchyard, that the ring was to Walter no mere family trinket, but something that touched a wound older and deeper than anyone in Ashcombe could guess. Alice left that afternoon with the blankets delivered, and a new unease settled in her chest. The first visible crack in 25 years of a marriage built upon the certainty that her husband was in all things a man beyond reproach. And here it is worth pausing a moment, because this story is not only about Margaret, nor only about a manor house, nor only about a widow's ring. It is about all those who are asked to hand back with a soft voice and talk of family honor, something that in truth belongs to them more than to anyone. The years given, the care carried quietly, the loyalty that is never written down on any deed because it is assumed it should be given out of love and not out of right. How many times has a woman of years, widowed or not, been treated as a stranger in the very house she herself held together through her own labor and patience, while those who never once lent a hand in the hard times stepped forward, all at once, as though they alone had any claim to what was left behind. If you have ever watched someone good stripped of what they built through their own sacrifice, stay with this story a little longer, because there are truths that take their time arriving, but when they arrive, they do not ask anyone's leave to sit down at the table. Only 3 days remained before the week's mind mass when Walter, his patience worn thin by answers the priest refused to give him, decided to take matters into his own hands. On a night without moon, accompanied by 2 servants he trusted absolutely, He came to the church door and demanded that the sexton let him through to the vestry. Father Cuthbert, roused by the pounding at his own house next to the church, arrived in time to place himself between Walter and the iron-bound coffer where the parish chest lay, his small frame trembling not with fear but with an indignation he had rarely, in 30 years of priesthood, had cause to show. "Not one step further, Sir Walter," he said, planted before the altar with his arms spread as though his own body might be enough to stop a man twice his strength. "For what you mean to touch is no family coffer, but the house of God, and any man who lays hand upon a sealed will, kept in trust before the altar, carries upon his soul a burden that not all the gold in your lands could lift." Walter stopped, not from fear of God, but because he calculated, in the cold way he calculated everything, that a scandal of sacrilege in his own parish before his own servants would cost him more than 3 more days of waiting. He drew back, but before he left, he fixed upon the priest a look that was, by now, without any disguise at all, a threat. "Remember, Father, who it is keeps this parish living with his tithes." Father Cuthbert made no answer. He only shut the vestry door behind him and kept watch, the whole night through, beside the chest, as a man keeps watch over a second body. The next day Walter, determined that no papers kept in a church should rob him of what he already considered his own, called together the leading men of the parish and the manor court, and announced that, once the week's mind mass was ended, the formal taking of possession of the manor house and the sheep pastures would be settled before the whole assembly in the churchyard, so that no man may doubt hereafter who governs this estate. The news traveled through Ashcombe faster than smoke from a chimney, and reached the bakehouse as well, where Margaret received it with the same calm face with which she had received every blow since the wake, though inwardly she felt the time that until then had crawled by like winter water suddenly rushing toward an ending. She could neither foresee nor prevent. Everything would be decided on the same day, in the same church. The Mass that was to reveal her husband's will, and the act that would seal before the whole assembly the final stripping her brother-in-law had spent weeks preparing. It was on the last of those 3 nights, with the parish already asleep beneath an early frost, that a rider spattered with mud to the shoulders came galloping through the gates of Ashcombe, his horse spent with exhaustion and his cloak soaked through and clinging to his body. The men keeping watch at the gate, who expected no one at such an hour, recognized with surprise by the light of their own torches the device stitched upon the newcomer's breast, that of Sir Roger de Vere, a knight of unimpeachable honor, godfather at Edmund and Margaret's wedding 20 years before, whom no one in the parish had seen since the burial, and whose arrival Father Cuthbert himself had not expected so soon. The rider did not stop to give the watchman any account of himself. He asked only for the priest's house, and toward it, without so much as dismounting fully, he turned his weary horse through the cold of a night that already promised, though none in Ashcombe could yet suspect it, that the coming morning would not bring the victory Sir Walter already counted as his own. Hodge, the steward, who slept lightly as a man learns to do after 30 years in service, heard the hoofbeats on the cobbles and looked out from his window in time to see the dark shape of the rider vanish toward the priest's house. He said nothing to anyone that night, but something in him, perhaps the same quiet loyalty that had bound him for 3 decades to Lord Edmund, made him feel for the first time since the old lord's death that justice had perhaps not entirely forgotten that household. Alice, too, unable to sleep for an unease that had troubled her for days, heard the distant sound of hooves from her bed and lay still beside her sleeping husband, wondering what new shadow was gathering over a union that only a week before had seemed to her as solid as the manor's own stone walls. The frost of that night seemed to promise, beyond the mere turning of the season, that nothing in Ashcombe would remain as it had been, and that the week's mind mass, awaited by all as the closing of a morning, would instead prove the beginning of something that no one, save an old priest and a mud-spattered knight, could yet imagine. Father Cuthbert opened the door of his own house before Sir Roger de Vere had even come to knock upon it, for he had gone 3 nights now with scarcely any sleep, and the trained ear of a man keeping vigil had caught, even through the rain and the weariness of the horse, the tread of one who came riding with the haste of justice and not of war. Sir Roger, his cloak still dripping and his face marked by 2 days of hard travel with almost no rest, wasted no time on courtesies. "Father, I had your letter 5 days past. I rode from my own manor the moment I understood what was asked of me. I stood godfather at Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret's wedding, and if the dead man named me executor of his last will, as your letter says, here I am to do what I swore then before the altar." The priest, his eyes wet with a relief he had not allowed himself to feel in weeks, brought him inside and told him, in a low voice, all that had happened since the wake: the public shaming, Margaret's exile to the bakehouse, Walter's attempt to force the chest, and the announcement that, once the week's mind mass was ended, the taking of possession of the whole estate would be settled before the assembly. Sir Roger listened without interrupting, his jaw growing tighter with every word, and at the end said only, "Then we arrived just in time, and not 1 hour to spare." The next morning, the parish church of Ashcombe filled as it had rarely filled outside the great feasts of the church year. The whole Ashcombe family occupying the foremost benches, the men of the manor court crowded near the pillars, servants and villagers packed all the way to the door, every soul bound by honor to attend the mass that closed the morning for Lord Edmund. Lady Margaret entered dressed in the same strict mourning she had worn to the burial, her veil framing her face, the garnet ring still steady upon her right hand, and took a quiet place near the back. Among the village women who had watched her shamed 7 days before, and now regarded her with a mixture of pity and curiosity that had not yet decided which way it would fall. Sir Walter, by contrast, sat in the family's place of honor with the confidence of a man who has already won his case, dressed in his finest doublet beneath his mourning cloak, and beside him Lady Alice kept her eyes lowered, unable now for days to look at her husband with the trust she once had. The Mass proceeded with the slow solemnity of a service for the dead, Father Cuthbert's Latin echoing beneath the stone vaulting, the incense rising toward the beams where swallows had nested in a summer now long gone, and Margaret felt each passing minute settle upon her chest like a stone whose full weight she could not yet know. When the offertory came, she saw Walter exchange a brief glance with Hodge, the steward, who waited near the side door with a rolled parchment beneath his arm, the deed of possession, already drawn up to be read and sealed before the manor court the moment the Mass was ended. All was arranged so that, the instant the priest pronounced the final blessing, the whole parish would witness the formal handing over of the manor house and the pastures into Walter's keeping, with no room left for doubt or for protest. But when Father Cuthbert finished speaking the words of dismissal, he did not step down from the altar as everyone expected. He remained standing before the people, his trembling hands now holding something he had drawn, with the greatest care, from the parish chest, and beside him, unlooked for by nearly all present, stood the tall, grave figure of Sir Roger de Vere, his traveling cloak still stained with dried mud, as though he had not been willing to spare even the time to change before taking his place beside the altar. A murmur ran through the whole church, and Walter, already rising to make his way toward the door where Hodge waited with the parchment, stopped short, his face crossed by the first shadow of doubt anyone had seen on him in 7 days. "Before this parish disperses," said Sir Roger, in a voice that needed no raising to reach the farthest corner of the church, "there is a will that must be honored, set down by Lord Edmund of Ashcombe, and entrusted to myself and to Father Cuthbert as his executors. No act of possession may be settled in this parish before this letter is read, for so he himself ordained it, by his own hand and under his own seal." Father Cuthbert broke the wax seal before the eyes of all, with a motion so slow it seemed to still time itself within the church, and unfolded the parchment with hands that no longer trembled from age, but from the solemnity of the moment. He began to read, and his voice, worn by 30 years of sermons, took on suddenly a firmness that surprised even those who had known him all their lives. "I, Edmund of Ashcombe, lord of this manor, being of sound mind though weakened in body, set down this my will to be read at the Mass kept for my weak's mind, before the manor court and my family assembled. For I know my brother Walter, and I know what he will do the moment my body lies beneath the earth." An utter silence fell over the church. Even the children who a moment before had fidgeted restlessly on the benches seemed to hold their breath. Walter, standing halfway between his bench and the door, dared not move, as though any gesture at all might confirm before everyone what he had already inwardly begun to fear. The letter went on, and the priest continued reading without lifting his eyes from the parchment. It formally confirmed the marriage portion brought by Lady Margaret on her wedding day 20 years before Sir Roger himself as witness and godfather. And it declared, in language plain and leaving no room for doubt, the widow's lifetime right of dower over the manor house and the pastures of Ashcombe, as the law of the realm allowed a husband to set down for a wife of second marriage. But the letter did not end there. Lord Edmund, with the clear-headedness of a man who knows he is writing his last words and means them to carry weight, added a second reckoning, this one addressed directly to his brother. He recalled before the court and before God the loan he had made him 20 years past when gambling debts and a wager on the wrong side of a border quarrel had threatened to strip Walter of the last of his lands, and he declared that the money, in large part, had come from the marriage portion Margaret brought to their union. Money Edmund had lent his brother and which Walter had never once repaid. A low murmur, almost a collective groan, passed through the benches when Father Cuthbert read out the exact sum of that debt, never before spoken aloud in Ashcombe, and Alice, beside her husband, brought a hand to her mouth in a gesture that was no longer surprise but a shame she had sensed coming for days without wanting to name it. Walter stood motionless, his face undone for the first time before the whole parish that had respected him for decades as a man of unquestioned honor, while the priest read the final line, the one that touched directly upon the wake and the ring. And knowing that my brother will demand of my wife the ring she wears, I set down here, that it stand on record before God and before men, that the ring was bought with money from Margaret's own marriage portion, given to me on our wedding day, and that it therefore belongs to her, and to her alone, by right and by justice. Father Cuthbert lowered the parchment, and for a moment the silence of the church weighed heavier than any sentence a judge could have passed. It was Sir Roger who broke that silence, stepping forward as named executor and with the authority granted him by 20 years of friendship and unimpeachable honor. This settlement, sealed by Lord Edmund and kept in the parish chest according to his will, stands confirmed before this court. Lady Margaret of Ashcombe retains her lifetime dower over the manor house and pastures of Ashcombe, as here set down, and Sir Walter of Ashcombe stands bound, before this same court, and upon pain of public disgrace, to repay in terms to be agreed, the debt here acknowledged. Walter did not answer. He could not. He searched for a moment the faces that only minutes before had sat beside him in the place of honor, and found nothing but eyes turning away, one after another, with the same slow deliberateness with which he himself had drawn off his gloves 7 days before to demand a ring that had never been his. Margaret, from the back of the church, did not move either, though something within her chest loosened at last, like a cord drawn tight for 7 days finally finding its rest. She felt no wish to go to her brother-in-law, nor to speak a single word of reproach. She only lifted her right hand almost without thinking to the garnet ring, and held it a moment between her fingers, as one who recognizes at last, with certainty, something that had always been hers, though she had never had the means to prove it. The whole parish, which 7 days before had watched her shamed in silence, looked upon her now with a different regard, not without wonder, for they had all borne witness to how the truth, kept locked away in the house of God, had arrived at the very moment a man stood ready to steal, before all of them, what was never his to take. Walter left the church that morning without ever signing the deed of possession before the assembled court, and in the weeks that followed his name, once spoken in Ashcombe with the respect due the blood of that family, began to be said in a lower voice, weighed down by a shame that neither his lands nor his lineage could wash away. He lost, first, the bench of honor he had held in church every Sunday, given without explanation to another gentleman of the shire, and lost, little by little, the quiet deference the men of the manor court had always shown him, which now became cold and distant courtesy. Lady Alice, who for 25 years had built her life upon the certainty of her husband's unquestioned honor, began to visit the manor house alone, without him, where Margaret now governed. And though the two women never spoke of the ring or the debt, something like a quiet truce wove itself between them. Two different victims of the same greed. Margaret returned to the manor house not as one who comes to claim a victory, but as one who returns at last to a place she should never have had to leave. She governed the sheep pastures with the same steady hand with which she had governed them in her husband's lifetime. And every autumn, when the shearing season came round, she would pause a moment before the family chapel where Edmund lay beside his first wife, and speak to him in silence, as though he could still hear her, thanking him not for the worldly protection he had left her, but for the certainty of having been, to his last breath, a man who kept his word. The garnet ring was never spoken of again in Ashcombe, but those who saw it catch the light on Margaret's hand at Sunday Mass knew well enough, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that the small gold circle stood for nothing of the Ashcombe fortune, but for the dignity of a woman they had once tried to erase before a coffin, and which the truth, kept safe in the parish chest, had restored to its rightful place. If this story reminded you of a woman who held her family together in silence and was treated as though nothing she had built was ever truly hers, write your name in the comments below, if only so that someone else may read it with the respect it deserves.